Welcome to part two of the lecture. This disturbing image, just to sort of follow on the point we were making about whether the media was being a watchdog or following the debate within the White House as to whether the Vietnam War should be, pursued or not. One of the things that certainly we cannot doubt, regardless of the veracity of either of those accounts, is that Vietnam did change the way the U.S. media was perceiving the war, the conflict. The images like this brought home to the U.S. population in a way that they had not experienced before. The human cost of the war. Journalists like Nick Utt and Don McCullen started to get close to the front lines in a way that journalists had never done before. They took photos in a way that, previously people would have seen some footage of the newsreels from the front, for example, but they would have been sort of almost propagandistic in the way they were, sort of like the nightly newsreel kind of approach in the local cinema or something. So to sort of see the human face of it, to know that these weren't just like the enemy. They weren't just a faceless enemy. They were real people. So from patriotic newsreels then of World War II to these sorts of photographs, you can see how people might be galvanized to change their views about the war. And this is another photograph that sort of follows in this kind of idea. What we can see here is the arbitrary, what was America fighting in Vietnam for? They had said for democracy, for freedom, against the tyranny of the communist regime. But when they saw photographs like this and they saw the arbitrary justice that US-sponsored forces in South Vietnam were waging on the civilian population, they became suspicious that the war was being fought for the right purposes. So photos like this reveal that the Vietnam War was in fact not a battle really between communists, the evil communists, and the democratic, sort of heroic U.S. forces with their Vietnamese allies. The truth was, in fact, that it was a civil war, a local civil war between peasants who were looking for democratic rights and an oppressive elite which the US was actually backing as a military dictatorship, effectively. And, famously, Henry Kissinger, around this sort of time, talked about, the US sponsoring some of these sort of dictators, whether Korea or Vietnam, and said, well, this is realist foreign policy. This is what we do. We separate sentiment from our domestic sentimentality from our foreign policy posture. And notoriously said things like, he may be a son of a bitch about the dictators. He may be a son of a bitch, but at least he's our son of a bitch. He's on our side. It doesn't matter what he's doing to his own people. So these sorts of things became shocking to the American population when they saw the actual faces of the people involved. And we mentioned Marshall McLuhan again, the media theorist who we talked about earlier on in part one. He stated that television, this is about the Vietnam effect, right? Television brought the brutality of war into the comfort of the living room. Vietnam was lost in the living rooms of America, not on the battlefields of Vietnam. So, look at this from the government's perspective, though, by the way. What lessons are they going to learn about photographs like this? They're going to learn that it's important to try to control them. So, henceforth, if the lessons were learned, they were basically twofold. One, never give the media unrestricted access to the battlefield, right? Always try to maintain control over that access. And two, practice news management by controlling the stories given to the media. Try to frame the story, try to provide scripts for the story, try to deliver media footage to the media, so that they don't have to send in cameramen, photographers themselves. The U.S. Armed Forces can provide that media for the news media. And I think that's precisely actually what happened, both this idea of not allowing access and then as a surrogate for that access providing footage that's sort of been massaged or sculpted to look a certain way, to feel a certain way to the viewing population at home. I think the U.S. media apparently, or the U.S. government, did learn its lesson, because by the time we get to the Gulf War, here we see the U.S. media managed in a very different way to the way that it was managed prior to, prior to this sort of development during the Vietnam War, where the media clearly was part of the losing battle on the home front. So the Gulf War, 1990 to 1991, it was here that we say this was the first information war, and we borrow this term from scholars like Baudrillard, the French philosopher, who famously wrote a book that said the Gulf War never took place. He didn't really mean the Gulf War had literally never took place. Of course, the Gulf War on the ground took place, but the war that the people saw on television at home was a war that the U.S. government and the U.S. media wanted the people to see, and there was quite a disconnect between the two. The media was showing footage of very glitzy or glamorous kind of spectacles in the sky, nighttime vision, images of bombs flying down chimneys. There was a very strong media effort to support the government's perspective and the government's idealized representation of the war to the folks back home. So that's what we mean when we say it was an information war. It was a war that was entirely dependent on massaging the information that the people at home got to see about the war. And many people would be critical of the Gulf War for that reason. The Department of Defense News Media Pool, DOD-NMP, was set up, and exactly what we were talking about in the last slide. They learned two lessons. One was and they used this Department of Defense News Media Pool to implement these lessons, or the strategies that they had based on their learning of these lessons. On the one hand, to prevent access to the front lines. Some journalists did, of course, go to the front lines, but this was the birth of what we called a sort of the Hilton journalism, where the journalists were holed up in the hotels of Kuwait or Saudi Arabia, and the government would call them into press conferences and show them footage of the war, and so the journalists were very happy to sit back and let the information come to them. Of course, the government wasn't going to just let any old journalist into these press conferences. They had to pass formal security reviews before they would gain admission, and so the government already knew to a certain extent that they would ask friendly questions and that they would not be hostile to the government's agenda. So this is, by the end of this, we would maybe be cynical. I wanted to offer you an anecdote from P.J. O'Rourke, because he, as a journalist himself, during the Gulf War, he was amazed at the kind of consensual relationship between the media and the government during this war. There was very little criticism going on in the media. They were kind of all on board. And for P.J. O'Rourke, this was partially because the technology had changed. It was possible now for the government to control the media in a way it hadn't done before, but also because the contexts, the way the media worked itself had changed. The media was now, and of course the viewers back home were now immersed in this sort of 24-hour, 7-day-a-week satellite news stream. Everything was instantaneous. Everything was up to date. So this leads us to P.J. O'Rourke's famous quote, which you can find on page 153 of your textbook, where he argues, P.J. O'Rourke's quote is that you may wonder what the job of being a Gulf War journalist is like. Well, we spend all day broadcasting on the radio and TV, telling people back home what's happening over here, and we learn what's happening over here by spending all day monitoring the radio and TV broadcasts from back home. You may wonder how any actual information ever gets into this loop. If you find out, please call. So obviously a humorous remark there, but certainly some truth to that. That's kind of this idea of a loop. Going back and forth is very, very relevant here. and worrying for us. So what PJ O'Rourke is, obviously the media itself had changed, the technology had changed, and it provided new opportunities for the government to massage the sort of the information that the people were getting back home. In this slide, we talk about an important historical development that was sort of like I guess if you will, a follow-on from the Vietnam effect. And it's, I guess, one of those stories that maybe would make you optimistic for the ability of the media. And of course, it's the story of the Live Aid concert in 1985, the day that music changed the world. Regardless of the perspective of some people who are cynical about the media, I think it's very, very clear that the African famine in the 1980s brought, just as those images from Vietnam did, these images from Ethiopia of starving children with distended bellies and flies crawling around their faces, that kind of thing, really did bring home to many people in the Western world, the realities of the hardship that many people were facing in other parts of the world. And I think Pierce Robinson offers a very interesting quote here from our textbook. The ability of real-time communications technology via the news media to provoke major responses from domestic audiences and political elites to both global and national events. This is what we call the CNN effect, and it's basically something that we already knew existed during the Vietnam War, but it was the emergence of CNN, the idea of a 24-hour a day global news network that was constantly streaming the news, bringing images into people's living rooms in a way that had never happened before, certainly intensified that earlier Vietnam effect. So the CNN effect is kind of like the Vietnam effect, but it's more intense. It's more intense. And that's what Pierce Robinson is trying to get at here. The technologies had changed. And the fact that people in their living rooms were now getting hit by these images, people like Bob Geldof in the photograph here, he was the lead singer of a band, an Irish band actually called the Boomtown Rats, but that's beside the point. He's a well-known media figure in the UK now, but at the time he wanted to go out to Ethiopia and take BBC television cameras with him, so that he could report back to people what was going on in Ethiopia and basically say, like, I'm not willing to accept this. This is outrageous. There's people in the Western world that have plenty of food and plenty of money. It's not right that people out here should be starving this way. So he went out to Ethiopia himself, and then coming back, organized this big rock concert to try to raise money and basically try to do something about it. So he was using rock and roll music to try to do something positive for people who are suffering from a famine. And it in a way it was a way to use the media to pressure the governments into doing something. And we've already talked about the Vietnam effect having sort of pressured the government into ending the Vietnam War. And of course, we've talked about how the Gulf War reversed that to a certain extent, but that's not to say that it goes the government's way every time. I think the awareness that people had of the conflict the famine in Ethiopia really did put pressure on governments and try to create a new context through which governments would deal with many third world countries. Another classic example of the CNN effect, by the way, which had a major impact on the US invasion, say in Somalia, was the famous image of a dead Marine being dragged through the streets of Mogadishu. That prompted Bill Clinton to get out of Somalia right away. I don't know if you guys were familiar with that case study. So some say that the CNN effect has now basically radically changed government's ability to manage the media at all, and that the government is basically helpless now in face of the media. And of course, internet plurality of Twitter feeds and Facebook feeds. If you remember what we were talking about vis-a-vis the conflict in Egypt, the revolution in Egypt, in Tahrir Square in Tunisia as well. How we were talking about how important and how seriously the governments there took the need to shut down Twitter and Facebook connection to the people. But they found ways and technologies, often assisted by companies like Google and Twitter. They found ways and technologies of keeping those connections up and running to a certain extent, to let people in the outside world especially know what was going on, but I think also to let people within coordinate with each other. And certainly, I think, just myself, that sometimes the government does win, and sometimes the people do win. I think the media has some ambiguity in its contextualization today, but it's not a simple question. You guys have your supplemental reading this week, and you'll be looking at a debate here where we have Bob McChesney suggesting that it's not enough to just praise the media or to be cynical about the media. Cass Sunstein obviously is knocking the media and worried about its sort of egocentrism with the Daily Me argument. But McChesney says it's not really a good idea just to sort of criticize the introversion that the Daily Me, the Twitter feed, the Facebook feed, and all these sorts of things can produce. That actually you have to kind of go a step further. And this is obviously a little bit off topic because we're talking about the CNN effect here, but if the CNN is part of the IT revolution, then I think it's important to talk about Twitter and Facebook as well, because the media is with the CNN effect is kind of a one-way phenomena, but now of course we have two-way IT media revolution, and of course with that happening, there are risks of each and every one of us having our own sort of private media experience, because the amount of channels on the internet is so amazingly huge. What Sunstein is worried about in the supplemental readings is that we might all sort of become sealed off from each other. And McChesney's saying, well, that's possibly true, but don't forget the fact that that sealing off from each other is going to happen in a context, and there's still tremendous wealth and tremendous power being exerted in the media space, in the media sphere, by the large capitalist corporations. They have the power of advertising. They have the power to sort of frame the space. And some voices shout louder than others in the IT revolution, I think, is what Bob McChesney is arguing. So that's all in your supplemental reading on Blackboard for this week, or for this module. In 2003, the government clearly showed that it had improved its strategy to control the media. Here the watchdog question really gets a battering as we see the low depths to which the government was willing to descend to control the media, to rein in this so-called CNN effect. We saw that they had controlled it a little bit during the first Gulf War, the Vietnam effect, but now of course the CNN effect is the intensification of the Vietnam effect. So how is the government going to control this? Well, their new strategy is to create this category of journalists called the embedded journalist, which is going to allow the journalists to have frontline access again, but only embedded with the troops. And so that creates a huge question, because the government, I think, actually at the end of the day embedded something like 600 journalists. And in a way, this was unprecedented access to the front lines for the media. But the journalists had to sign a contract, get this right, the journalists had to sign a contract restricting what they could say and photograph. And they weren't allowed to say anything about future operations or prisoners of war or anything like this at all, lest it challenge national security. So I think many journalists would have been upset by that, because it was a constriction on what they could do. Obviously, and from a national security perspective, it's what the government wants. But the media has always sort of been able to challenge this in the past. Were they going to be able to challenge this in the context of embedded journalism? I think clearly the evidence is that they couldn't. They also, many people were worried that embedded journalists are going to sort of feel what the French call an esprit de corps, or a bond, a social bond with the soldiers that they're embedded with, and it's in which case they'd be taking a side, which is worrying. You don't want journalists taking a side. I mean, maybe it's good to be on good terms with journalists, but you don't want journalists to be your friends. You want them to do their job. You want them to report the news. if journalists are taking a side, then you're in trouble, right? So many people wonder how so many Americans got it wrong on the Iraq War, and this poll, this information here, this data sheet instead gives some information about why that might be so. Let's look at these two questions because they're interesting. Here we have question 1. Since the war ended, the US has found Iraqi weapons of mass destruction. How many people believed that that was true? Well, it appears that 33% of Fox News viewers felt that it was true, even though, of course, clearly it wasn't true. And then you see descending from there, people who read newspapers a lot were the lowest of all. If they were reading the newspapers, then they were clearly seeing the fine print analysis and spending time reflecting on what they were seeing and coming to the conclusion that there were no WMDs in Iraq. So that's a very interesting statistic for us that shows us quite clearly the difference in persuasion of the people that were curious about WMDs in Iraq. Another question. The US has found clear evidence that Saddam Hussein was working closely with Al-Qaeda terrorist group. 67% of Fox News viewers believed in 2003 that Saddam Hussein was working closely with Al-Qaeda, whereas people who followed print newspapers and listened to PBS and NPR obviously had a much lower likelihood of thinking that there was a linkage there. And of course there was no linkage, as we know now, but that's not what the government was saying then. So the government clearly knew what it was doing. It was clearly trying to, use certain media outlets to promote its message. And of course we know that the government was actively doing this. One thing that the government was doing, it recruited 75 retired military officers to appear as experts on TV outlets, as reported in the New York Times in April 2008. What this means is that the government was trying to get retired military officers to appear on television and tell their side of the story, but not wearing the hat, so to speak, of being a Pentagon spokesperson. They were appearing as independent military experts. And so people, would expect these experts to have, something like an objective analysis or an impartial analysis because they're on television as experts. But of course, they weren't experts at all. They were retired military officers who had been recruited by the Pentagon to tell a very specific version of the story. So that clearly shows that the government was very much trying to frame the war during 2003 and to use the CNN effect, so to speak, to its advantage. The Pentagon documents that were leaked pertaining to this story, by the way, that the New York Times intercepted, referred to Pentagon strategy papers demanding that these military officers, by the way, be used as message force multipliers. That's a quote, by the way. Message force multipliers are surrogates. And they would actively appear on television programs and appear on write op-eds for newspapers. So if that's not propaganda, then what is it? So it's probably not a surprise then that many Americans turned away from television sources and news media sources in the mainstream to start to think and work on things like blogs. And one famous blog, Where is Raed, an ordinary Iraqi citizen who was critical of both Saddam regime and the U.S. invasion, he published a lot of material on his website that people found very persuasive, which showed both sides of the story in the Iraq War. And then, of course, we had the story of the fact that the government had banned photographing of coffins coming back from the Gulf War in order to try to prevent the sort of body bag effect that was prevalent during the Vietnam War, where people saw the body bags coming back. So, if we've learned in this class today about different sort of perspectives on why the media does what it does, let's try to put some formal language in there. In this slide, we discussed the contradiction between pluralist theory and elite theory. Pluralist theory is basically Jefferson's view that we talked about earlier on, that if we only have a vibrant newspaper sector, then, well, people are rational, they'll read the newspapers and they'll come to rational conclusions, they'll do the right thing. But elite theory argues that we live in a hierarchical society where the wealthy are more powerful. So we talked about Bob McChesney a moment ago and his view that, even in an internet-powered media sphere, we still have bias, we still have prejudice, because power is able to create a kind of an effect where the certain voices are able to shout louder than others and certain messages get across. And of course we see that very clearly in the statistics we saw on the previous slide. We saw that in the fact that the government and the Pentagon were trying to position experts, neutral experts, in the media sphere to try to represent a pro-government perspective on the war in Iraq. We know that the media works to secure the interests of the ruling class then. If we take that perspective, the elite theorists make that point. And they would argue that there is, of course, debate in the media, but it's only debate within a narrow margin. So, for example, during the 2008 election, John McCain and Barack Obama engaged in intense debate with each other, not about whether the war was good or bad, but about how to win the war. They were debating the merits of George Bush's strategy in Iraq. They were not debating the merits of whether the war itself was a good thing or not. And many elite theorists would argue that shouldn't surprise us, because that the elites, while they may call themselves Republicans and Democrats, are still elites, and they represent powerful corporate interests, and the corporate news is really there to represent the disagreements and debates between them as the debates and disagreements, as opposed to exploring other perspectives and other points of view outside of the range of interests that the elites represent. So that's why we have this cartoon here. You write what you're told. Thanks, corporate news. We couldn't control the people without you. The media, they're clearly not doing its job if it's just basically supporting the viewpoint of one or other sort of, if you will, branch of elite power. Elite theorists are interested in trying to theorize where debate comes from in the media and the extent to which debate in the media is revolutionary or not, or controversial or not. Does it really contest government plans, government desires? So if pluralists do exaggerate the effect of CNN, the CNN effect is supposed to increase pressure on policymakers to act out in humanitarian crises. But many elite theorists challenge the CNN effect. For example, Chomsky and Herman do argue that the government can manufacture consent. It can create consensuality among the people. Similarly, Hallen, who we cite here, argues that while the media attacked the government during the Vietnam War, they did not really attack the fear and paranoia about communism that made the war possible in the first place. This is similar to our moment ago conversation about McCain versus Obama in the first election campaign in 2008. Where the debate there, of course, was the extent to which we should be fighting the war or not. For this older question about the Vietnam War, the media was not really out to challenge the way the government had framed the need for the war in the first place. So it's very similar kind of a predicament. The government had used a lot of techniques of generating fear and spoken about a communist menace to frame the need for the Vietnam War. But as we know now, the communism of Vietnam wasn't really the main reason the people were out fighting against the Americans there. They were fighting against the Americans there because they believed that they were being governed by a corrupt regime. And of course, once the truth started to come out about that, we had the Tet Offensive and the generally huge decline in popularity of the American armed forces in Vietnam. So the important thing that we're trying to observe here, and we look at this slide, is that there's different sort of positions that the media can adapt in relation to government's preferred message. The media can operate within the sphere of consensus, in which case there's no deviation from the media and the position of the government. There's the sphere of legitimate controversy, in which case the journalists may reflect some debate, but it'll be kind of like the debate that happened during the Vietnam War. It won't really be an in-depth or detailed debate, or it'll be kind of like the debate between McCain and Obama. The media will follow along with that debate and engage in that debate, but it won't really go to the third position that we have here, which is the sphere of deviance, where journalists challenge government on so-called taboo policy issues. That's a hugely important concept, right? The idea of a taboo policy issue. If you go there, you are considered to be making an apostate point. So, for example, there was the Ward Churchill scandal during the 2003-2004 period, where, or perhaps I think she might have been more like 2006. But Ward Churchill had, as a professor, college professor, had said that he felt that the people who died in 9/11 in the World Trade Center could be considered, from the perspective of the bombers, to be collateral damage, just as the people that the government sometimes kills, civilians that the government sometimes kills, are considered collateral damage. And the government, obviously, in using that term, is trying to say, well, like, it's unfortunate, but this is war after all, and people die during wars. But he was trying to make the argument that, well, the bombers could say the same thing in response, that they were attacking the World Trade Center, and that the people who died were just collateral damage, and it was their fault for being near the building in the first place because it was a legitimate target of war or something. So, the man was, savaged in the media, and loads of people criticized him and said he shouldn't say such things. There's an example of sphere of deviance, all right. So the argument here is not that the media in the United States is somehow secretly in collusion or conspiring with the government. We're not really saying that, of course, because that would be really, really hard to prove, and it's probably not true either. But rather what we're saying here is that there's a consensus of views among the elites who own and manage the media, and this consensus screens out the diversity of voices that pluralism presupposes, right? So pluralism says there's all these voices bubbling away, and today's day they would really sort of fantasize about Twitter and Facebook and all these different voices that are out there circulating. But if there's a consensus of views among the elites who own and manage the media, then we have a problem there, to be sure, because it means that we cannot rely on the media to tell us the truth about what's going on, to give us the full breadth of facts. And that's unfortunate, of course, if that's true. Now, there's a third perspective. We've talked about pluralism, we've talked about elite theory, now we're talking about cultural theory, and I'll move through this very, very quickly. Pluralists and elite theorists tend to ignore the audience's role. Stuart Hall, however, who is pictured here, has another perspective, and he suggests that, I guess Stuart Hall, he's kind of somewhere between the two. He's adopting a sort of a middle ground perspective between the elite theorists and the pluralists. And he's saying that the audience actually, the one thing that you shouldn't forget here is that the audience does actually have a power of interpretation. And the media can prefer to put something out in a certain way, but content is always polysemic, he says, which means that it has multiple potential interpretations, and the audiences can decode preferred meanings in different ways, right? So obviously some people will go for the media's dominant interpretation, which he calls the dominant hegemonic position. Then most of us, he says, will be somewhere in this position called the negotiated position. And then thirdly, there's this thing called the oppositional position, which is where we're sort of actively engaged in a standpoint that wants to challenge and look between the lines of almost everything the media says. But in negotiated positions where most of us are, and that's because we're active viewers as opposed to passive viewers. We are aware, most of us, that the media is saying something that is a point of view, and so we know that there's a need for sort of taking everything with a pinch of salt, and we know that it's important not to be brainwashed. We may not be oppositional to what we're seeing, but we're sort of more neutral, or not taking a side, might be a better way to put it. And so, given that most people are in that second position, there's no guarantee that the audience will get the message, so to speak. The audience may struggle against the preferred meaning of the government, then again it may not. But what Stuart Hall, I think, is sort of inviting us to think about here is, maybe there's things going on here in the interpretation of the message of the media that are dependent on other factors, like emotions, for example. What role do emotions play? If Jefferson and the elite theorists are disagreeing about the extent to which the viewership is rational, what they don't do is they don't tell us why that rationality might be manipulated or unreliable. In the next slide, in this slide, we ask the question about how we might read the media and its tendency to engage in emotional sort of techniques of stylization. And Stuart Hall uses the example, in the chapter, to demonstrate this theory of Hall's. We look at the movie Saving Private Ryan. And it's interesting to think about this movie because Steven Spielberg said that this movie was an anti-war statement. And of course, when you look at the movie and you see how vicious and bloodthirsty some of the scenes are, and how real the perception or feeling of being in a war is, you're almost in there in the war zone. Many people had to leave the audiences, the theaters, to they were so disturbed by what they were seeing, especially veterans, because it felt so realistic. And so in this sense, many people would have agreed with Spielberg saying it was an anti-war statement, because it does reveal the terrible price that we sometimes have to pay for justice and democracy. After all, because World War II many people feel was a good war, and it was a war that had to be fought. And what else could we have done? So that's an important point. But for others, like historian Howard Zinn, it is nevertheless a problematic movie because it portrays the war in a kind of a very, very black and white way, the good guys and the bad guys. And it's a war, basically, it's a movie about a war between good guys and bad guys. And, we learn about the background, the family background, the lives, the passions of the heroes. We learn about the American soldiers in tremendous detail, and we get strong impressions of their life back at home. We don't get anything like that about the Germans. We don't get to see them at all. So, in that sense, the movie tries to make us feel good about us, the glory of military heroism, as if there was somehow a war that was good, as if this was somehow a war that was good. But the question we might ask, says Zinn, is there ever really a war that is worth it? Is any war ever really worth it? All this blood and suffering and death. Is it ever, can you ever put a value on that? Can you ever say that a victory was worth all that pain? Is there a mathematical formula that allows you to work that out scientifically or objectively? Actually, there isn't. There's no way to do that. There's no way to actually sort of calculate exactly the benefit that a war has, or that a war brings you. So how do we shortcut that? How do we shortcut this need to calculate it? And what we can argue, what Stuart Hall would argue, what Howard Zinn would argue, that the movies have ways of presenting truths to us, arguments to us emotionally, not just rationally, not just as an argument, but as a sort of a seduction. And so in this sense, movies manipulate our emotions. They bypass rational thought by using dramatic music, choreographed combat sequences, narrative, faceless enemies, stereotypical characters, etc. And so through these techniques, it becomes easy for us to escape into this fantasy world, as a sort of a surrogate for our own. So what we might be tempted to ask then, if we want to investigate the possibility of either having a dominant hegemonic position, which would be sort of Spielberg's perspective, or an oppositional position, the oppositional position would definitely focus in on all these emotions, the way the story was told, but also especially I think the timing of the story. It wasn't just a war, it wasn't just a movie about a good war at any old time. It was a movie about a war at a specific time, and it asked us to think about war while there were other things going on. This very black and white simplistic war is being represented to us, and we're finding out about heroes in this black and white simplistic war at a time when the real wars that were going on in the world were tremendously complex, i.e. the Kosovo bombing, the Gulf War, etc. So this is all obviously pre 9/11, but it does sort of make us think about heroes and assume that we are the good guys, and that all movies that our guys are involved in, all wars that our guys are involved in, are thusly quite simple in their nature, as being oppositions between good and bad guys. And so what's the responsibility of the audience here, now that we know that movies do tend to simplify conflicts? One might say that the responsibility of the audience is to know, to try to make sure that we, where possible, go to movies and have an oppositional position. We were just looking at the Oscars this year in 2013. The Oscars featured a movie, Argo, and it became the best movie, the Oscar-winning movie. And the directors, producers of this movie have all sort of come out in public and said, they were very dedicated to telling the truth about the conflict. And actually, the more we know about the movie, the more it's clear that it's not telling the truth about the conflict at all. It was representing the conflict in a very specific way. The movie is the story, obviously, about the Iranian Revolution and the storming of the embassy in downtown Tehran, the U.S. embassy. And we have a very sort of spellbinding account, and there's a thrilling car chase at the end, and it's it's very suspenseful. But the true story there actually featured none of this sort of car chasing and suspenseful drama at the airport and that kind of thing. They didn't even all go on the same plane. They all went on separate planes. So all of that is represented. It's acting, it's theater, it's dramatics. And again, it's the use of emotions to try to create a sense of a simplicity in the story, where maybe complexity is actually more close to the truth. So I like sort of thinking about this topic. I think it's one of the few ways that one of the few themes for debating a topic like this that we have in this class, that allows us to think about our responsibility, our choices in interpreting a lot of what we see and do, or are invited to see and invited to do through the media, and especially through movies, which of course have this potential to be very educational in some ways, educational for the better, educational for the worst, you know what I mean? They shape, they mold our expectations of what's going on in the real world. And so consequently, it's very important that we, as the viewers, think about our responsibility very seriously. So that's the end of this lecture, folks. Hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you in class later this week.